Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site, bettingangle.us, a free site. It's November 2nd, 2025. Let's talk about a couple of fights. The EBU, European Light Heavyweight fight, Bradley Beal versus Lyndon Arthur. Right, let's also talk about the Joshua Buatsi, Zach Parker fight. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Folks, you know, the Bradley Rhea versus Lyndon Arthur fight is really why we love boxing and why we bet on boxing. Just understand that Rhea, younger guy than Arthur, right, by 7 years, which is a lifetime in boxing. He was the EBU European Light Heavyweight Champion. But just understand, 3 fights ago, he was fighting in 6-round fights. Right? This is a guy who didn't have anything close to the experience of Lyndon Arthur, who of course went the distance with Anthony Yarde twice, lost a third match with Yarde, but let's just say he had a series of fights with Yarde where he held his own for 2 of them. He also fought Dimitri Bivol, went the distance in that fight. He fought Liam Cameron. He has one of the best jabs in the sport in any division. Right? So Arthur, substantially more experience in 10 and 12 round fights than Bradley Rhea. Now the reason I mention it is that Rhea was the favorite in the fight. I didn't understand it. I told premium subscribers, oh, bet the underdog in this one straight up. Right? Rhea was the favorite in the fight. Now here's where boxing really gets interesting. Rhea sees himself as alpha. So Rhea, comes in the ring. He has a lot of swag. He's aggressive, right? Early in the fight, he comes across the ring. Here's where it gets hairy. This is also why we bet on boxing, right? I thought Lyndon Arthur was the vastly superior technician. But Rhea comes across the ring. He sees an old man in front of him. Right, Lyndon Arthur did not look good in the Brian Suarez fight, was lucky to win that fight. Rhea comes across the ring, is throwing big shots, big hooks, lands on Lyndon Arthur, drops him early. Now, Arthur gets off the canvas. He's dazed and confused, but he still has his experience. Now, I believe lay people, if someone were to hit most of us in our left eye, right, particularly early in a fight while we're trying to process the angles, we would try to gear our defense toward that eye. So someone hits me in my left eye, the film here is inverted. If someone hits me in my left eye, I might come in and be like this to try to protect myself from other shots. But understand, this is professional fighting. So that would leave this side of my head completely unprotected. In other words, lay people don't think the way experienced boxers do. Here, Lyndon Arthur is badly hurt. He's been dropped. He gets up. He's fighting a guy 7 years younger than him. But Arthur has the experience to know that he needs to protect both sides of his face. So you notice Arthur buying time, and he has both hands up. He gets hurt at different times in this fight, right? But he has both hands up. In other words, Arthur is the vet who protects himself when he needs to. Then, of course, as Arthur clears his head, the dynamic of the fight changes. Arthur's skill set, his experience take over. You notice that Rhea is hook heavy, right? He's too upright. He's too aggressive. He's not going to be on his back foot, dodging punches, changing the dynamic. So when he's on his front foot, there's an element of surprise. Right? Again, this is a guy who was fighting 6-round fights 3 fights ago. So Arthur starts throwing combinations. You notice the types of punches that Arthur's throwing include uppercuts, right? Arthur starts to open up the toolkit. By the end of the fight, Arthur, the underdog, has taken over the fight. Because, quite frankly, when he's not getting caught with shots and hurt, Arthur's the superior fighter. You also notice, too, and in fairness to Rhea, Rhea won the EBU European Light Heavyweight Championship in a 12-round fight. But just understand, he hasn't been in the championship rounds before this fight against this level of fighter. So, as the fight goes along, the superiority of Lyndon Arthur comes through, right? Straighter punches. In other words, Rhea is trying to land a hook. Hooks don't have the spacing that a great straight jab has, right? So you see the Lyndon Arthur jab. You see Arthur getting there first. You see that Arthur doesn't need a lot to get a punch through. You also saw that Rhea really didn't know how to clinch Arthur, didn't know how to slow down Arthur, wasn't defensively blessed. So folks, the casino gave away one yesterday. I know the fight was close, I understand, one judge had it a draw, right? All I can say is, you got the vastly superior fighter. The guy who fought and went the distance with Beevil, right? The guy who dealt with a much bigger puncher than Rhea, right, in Anthony Yard, and who went the distance with Yard twice. At a minimum, you had a guy who had much more experience going the distance against world-class competition. And Arthur, technician, is only something like 34 years old. It's not like he's 40. And of course, he delivered. So you got better than even money on this play. Also, as you see Rhea come across the ring, and he's the younger guy, and he's throwing big shots early, he's pursuing Arthur, you thought to yourself, you know what, this is high risk. But the secret to boxing is, understand, these fighters hang in small groups. Many of the people around the fighter support themselves financially through the fighter. So many of these fighters don't know the risk they're taking. In other words, Rhea comes across the ring, and it paid off for him. He got the knockdown early against Lyndon Arthur, right? But you didn't get the feeling this guy understood that being reckless, being hyper-aggressive against Lyndon Arthur, a guy with a great jab, opens you up to counters, right? This guy, because he was the favorite, because he was the champ coming into the fight, I don't think he appreciated that the old man, and I know 34 seems ancient to people in their 20s, right? But I don't think he understood that the old man had fought Anthony Yard just 2 fights ago and went the distance with him. That the old man had been places in the ring that Rhea had never been, right? He figured it out by the 11th round, but by then it was too late. Arthur had come back in the fight. Now let's talk about a controversial fight. I understand There are people online saying that the announcers were biased. There's another group online saying that the judges were biased. Um, Joshua Buatsi, Zach Parker. Let me just say, you know, boxing is the kind of sport where two people can watch it and see completely different fights. Right? The fight I saw, the center of gravity was important here. Right? Buatsi had a higher center of gravity and, in my opinion, looked stiff, looked robotic, looked predictable. Put differently, he wasn't the level of athlete that Zach Parker was. Right? Buatsi's coming forward. He's, trying to land shots on Parker. Parker has a back foot. Right? Parker's more fluid. Parker could get underneath Buatsi. Parker has a back foot. Parker's ambidextrous. Parker, and this is the skill that suggests to me that Parker is a live underdog going forward. Parker can clinch on demand. This is the A-level clincher. And he can clinch in more than one way. Right? This is the guy who, you try to bum rush him in the pocket, he can lean forward and clinch you. Right? Let's say that's a defensive clinch. The guy can also offensively clinch you. By that I mean, he can be outside, moving around, making you miss. Then to regulate the action, he can step in the pocket and stop you cold by clinching you. Now, if you saw the coordination gap here, right, this is pronounced, as it is with Fury and Usyk, right? Usyk is the better athlete than Fury. It's jarring in the ring, right? Fury, one of the most skilled heavyweights I've ever seen. But after a life where he had some drug problems, possibly alcohol problems, mental health problems, let's just say Fury, in his mid-30s now, can't keep up with 38-year-old Usyk. Here, once you see the coordination gap between Buatsi and Parker, once you're realizing that Parker's able, because of his clinching, to stop the fight whenever he wants. In other words, Buatsi comes forward, Buatsi's throwing shots, Parker dips his head, somehow is able to tie up Buatsi's hands and clinch him. Right? Once you see it and you see the athletic gap, right? The fact that Buatsi's always at one level, right? Parker is like this, but then he's like this, then he's outside, then he's moving left, he's moving right. I like an educated back foot. Parker has one. I didn't think he was running. I thought he was frustrating Buatsi. Once you see the athletic gap here, it's hard to give Buatsi around. Right? The fight, this almost looked, and don't get me wrong, Buatsi's landing some clean shots because Parker's a little bit high risk. Right? So Parker has his hands down, he's moving. Occasionally you would notice Parker get caught flush and his head go back. But I thought Parker won this fight. I'll even go further. Folks, 175 is loaded. Parker's ability to clinch and his level of athleticism in a division that has some hyper-aggressive front foot guys. I'll name two, Benavidez and Beterbiev. Right? You get the feeling that Zach Parker would be a live underdog against both. Now, what do I mean by that? And it's important to figure this one out. By live underdog, I don't mean necessarily that Zach Parker beats Benavidez. I don't mean necessarily that Zach Parker beats Beterbiev. Right? But understand, my belief is that if two world-class fighters fought 10 times, let's say the guy who's the better fighter might win 6 or 7 of the 10. Right? The other guy would win 3 or 4. In other words, I believe in probabilities, not certainties. Right? Even when the fight looks mismatched, I believe that Zach Parker is a better athlete than David Benavidez. Let's name the top of the division. With respect to the Beeville crowd, I believe that Zach Parker is a better athlete than David Benavidez. If Zach Parker, using his defensive skills, and this is a guy who can turn, this is the benefit of being a great athlete. Right? To me, this is the difference between Crawford and Mayweather, who I think's a freak athlete, was a freak athlete in his prime. Right? Let's give a guy in retirement the opportunity to be in retirement. But Parker can get a shoulder between him and you. Right? In other words, Parker, this is the superior athlete. So he's moving around. He has the rhythm of the fight. He can spot when you are coming forward. He can get a shoulder between you and him. That's one thing he does. He can clinch. If because of his skill set, this is the guy who is defensively aware. Right? As I said, he did get hit with some flush punches, but you could tell he's defensively aware. It's all a calculated risk for him. If he can find a way to moderate Benavidez's aggression, Beterbiev's aggression, and if he can land his own shots, be on his back foot long enough to make the other guy miss. Isn't this what Beeville did against Beterbiev? Right? Be on the back foot enough to have the hyper-aggressive guy miss, but also be enough of an athlete to take a step forward and clinch. In other words, make the fight messy. This fight was messy, but I thought it had a clear winner, Zach Parker. Right? The judges disagreed with me. Hey, that's the way it goes sometimes in boxing. Right? You know, you say, oh, okay, this guy won. Then they announce the scores, and you're like, what? I remember the first, I had a bet on the first Lennox Lewis Evander Holyfield fight. I was on the phone with the guy at the end of the fight. He was congratulating me. Then they announced the scorecards. They call that fight a draw. Food out my mouth, food off my plate. Didn't win anything on a fight I thought my guy won. Here, Zach Parker, folks, and it's an if, you would have to watch the first 2 to 3 rounds to figure out if it's a reality. If Zach Parker can clinch Benavidez on demand, something Morrell was unable to do. Right? Something Caleb Plant didn't even try. Right? Plant's on his back foot, moving around. I mentioned Plant because that was one of the closest Benavidez fights we've had. Right? Plant actually has a lead in that fight. Then Benavidez starts to have him tire. If Zach Parker can clinch Benavidez, style-wise, Parker Benavidez would be riveting. Right? Same thing with Beterbiev. If Beterbiev comes forward, ready to throw big hooks and stuff, and if Zach Parker is the superior athlete, and he is, and can clinch and neutralize Beterbiev. Right, folks? We would be in a zone that we haven't been with Benavidez or Beterbiev. Right? Let me just say, whoever you think won this fight, and we talk about these fights really to get a future edge on the casino. Right? Whoever you think won this fight, just understand Zach Parker is the fighter with the greater upside. Right? I want you to look at the film and just see the clinching and understand that's a weapon. Right? And of course, Parker has offensive skills. Parker has greater punch variety, for example, than Buatsi. He makes Buatsi look robotic here. Right? So, the truth is that boxing is a very rough sport. Buatsi's already lost to Callum Smith. There's a possibility that some champion sees this fight, Benavidez sees this fight, and then thinks to himself, wow, this guy looks so uninspired that since he officially got the win, I have plausible deniability. I can fight Buatsi knowing that I know how to beat him, knowing that he can't clinch me, knowing that I can neutralize his power. Isn't that what Zach Parker just did? Right? But understand, there's another school to boxing. Years ago, Robert Helenius, who was up and coming at the time, fought Derek Chisora. Right? And many people, I'll raise my hand, thought Chisora beat him. One of the people who thought Chisora beat him was then heavyweight champion Vitaly Klitschko, who didn't have to fight Chisora because Chisora officially had lost the fight. Well, believe it or not, in one of boxing's better moments, Vitaly Klitschko said he thought Chisora won the fight. He gave Chisora the shot at the title. Folks, be careful. You let a hungry man in for dinner, he might eat all the food. Chisora, believe it or not, goes the distance against Vitaly Klitschko. Actually gave Vitaly Klitschko one of his better fights. Obviously, Vitaly Klitschko fought Lennox Lewis, and that's one of the all-time fights in my eyes, right? But let's just say Chisora certainly is on the short list of guys who challenged, gave real challenges to Vitaly Klitschko. Right? Honorable mention, Chris Bird, surviving long enough to get the win against Vitaly Klitschko. Klitschko throws out his shoulder. Right? But my point to you is, there's a possibility, given the outcry on this fight, that a champ at 175 says, hey, you know what? I think Zach Parker won that fight. I'm going to give Zach Parker the shot at my title. It could be a voluntary. Right? It's more beer for the champ. Let's say Buatsi becomes a mandatory. A champion would be able to get a payday on the voluntary. The fans would say, wow, this champ is fighting the guy who actually won the fight. And then he could pivot and say, let me also fight Buatsi. Get the payday for that fight. Let me just say, in terms of athlete, and keeping in mind, Bivol actually used to be a knockout puncher. Right? A fight between Bivol, and Bivol's coming off surgery. You always have to be careful when a guy's coming off surgery. If Bivol's healthy and he fights Zach Parker, folks, you would be watching a fight between two of the better athletes in the sport. Right? There's an athleticism gap in this fight. Parker, underrated. Right? Better defensive skills. I believe Parker takes his foot a little bit off the gas. because he has Buatsi coming into his shoulder. He knew he could clinch Buatsi on demand. It's clear at the end of this fight that he clearly thought he won the fight. Right? Keep an eye on Zach Parker. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Let me also point out something that's obvious to my long-time subscribers. Please feel free. Keep in mind, I'm coming off of, calling the Canelo-Crawford fight for Canelo. Right? Please feel free to disagree with me in the comment section of this YouTube video. Right? I'm not some, person on a mountain here. We're friends just talking boxing. If you disagree with me, and if you feel that Buatsi clearly won this fight, if you feel that Buatsi is the level of athlete that Zach Parker is, tell us about it in the comment section. You don't have to agree with me. Just be forthright and give your opinion. Thanks for stopping by.